Hi, and welcome to module number 43. This is going to cover multi-resolution approximation. Again, the details are going to appear in the notes by Mike Waken. And this is a continuation of the wavelets material and connects ideas from wavelets to approximation of spaces. So let's begin with the definition of a multi-resolution approximation space. We have a sequence of subspaces, Vj, Vj plus 1, Vj plus 2, Vj minus 1, etc. And these are subspaces of L2 of R. Recall that L2 of R means these are finite energy spaces, finite energy functions that are continuous over the real line. Could be a continuous function of time, space, etc. And the sequence of subspaces is called a multi-resolution approximation, or MRA, if the following conditions hold. And there are extra conditions, and they are listed, for example, in the notes by Mike Waken. There are also details in the textbook by Stefan Malat, but I'm giving you the main things. So first of all, property number 1 is a nested property. So Vj plus 1 is a subset of Vj. Property number 2 says that in a limit of large J's, Vj is the zero function. So that's the limit for large J's. And what about the limit for small J's, J going to negative infinity? In that case, we're covering L2 of R. Okay, so we understand the first property, the second and third properties are limits. The fourth property says that for all J and K, J tells us which Vj we're looking at, and K is a shift, okay? So if f of t is an element of fj, this occurs if and only if the shifted version we shift by 2 to the power of j multiplied by k, the shifted version is also an element of Vj. So all the shifts need to be there. Property number 5. For all the j's, ft is an element of Vj if and only if f of t over 2. So this one is a slower function, and that is an element of Vj plus 1. So we're seeing that the Vj plus 1s are slower, and they contain fewer functions. And because of that, in the limit of large J's, we only have the zero function. There are extra conditions on V0. For example, you can look at the textbook by Malat for details. So here's a visualization. Again, we have the nested property. Vj is nested inside Vj minus 1. In turn, Vj plus 1 is nested inside Vj. And in the limit of j going very small, negative infinity, we have L2 of R. And similarly, in the limit of j going to plus infinity, we have the zero function. So zero meaning a function. F of t is equal to 0. So now we understand that we have a multi-resolution approximation space, and we want to tie it into other concepts that we've been discussing, orthogonal bases and wavelets. So under some conditions, psi j n of t form an orthonormal basis for L2 of R. And psi j n of t, we're going to have, first of all, j is going to be the scale, and it appears both in the magnitude and in how quickly the function moves. And n is going to be a shift, a time shift. Okay, so under some conditions, we have that this wavelet psi becomes an orthonormal basis. Now, in addition to that, we also have a connection to multi-resolution approximation spaces, but let's look at two examples. First of all, a Haar multi-resolution space. Phi of t is a function, and it's one when the time t is between 0 and 1, else 0. And phi of t is used to set v0. Okay, so phi of t fits into v0 because v0 is the set of all piecewise constant functions in L2 of R with discontinuities at integer locations. Okay, so to visualize this, horizontal axis is t, vertical axis is f of t, and L2 of R meaning finite energy, so it might be something like this, but it's a staircase function. So these are integers, 1, -1, 0, 2, and so on. And we can express f of t as a superposition of phi of t translated by integers. So this is a summation over, let's say, integers n. N is in the element of script z. Script z means the set of integers. Alpha n phi of t minus n. Now, what about the other v's? This is v0. So v -1 has its continuities at -half, 0, +half, basically multiples of half. V plus 1 has its continuities at multiples of 2, and vj is a piecewise constant function, again in L2 of R, so finite energy, with its continuities at integer multiples of 2 to the power of j. And you may notice that earlier we talked about the wavelet function, which had a bandpass type of characteristic, and we said that its DC component was 0. The integer over psi of t was 0, but here the integer over phi of t is not 0. So this does contain information at the lowest frequencies, the coarsest scale, and we're soon going to connect phi of t to psi of t. So that was example number 1, and let's look at another example, which I'm sure you're quite familiar with, the Shannon multi-resolution space. So here, phi of t is actually a sinc function. Sine of pi over t divided by pi t. And this sinc function is band limited. So if we were to plot the horizontal axis is frequency omega, and the vertical axis is phi of omega, it'll be band limited between, let's say, -omega0 and plus omega0, whatever the numbers would be. Now, Vj is a set of band limited functions in L2 of R. And they're band limited such that omega is between -2 to the minus j pi and plus 2 to the minus j pi. So let's work through a few examples. V0, omega is band limited between, so 2 to the 0 is 1, so -pi and plus pi. And if we sketch it, the horizontal axis again will be omega, and somewhere inside the range between -pi and pi, we have information. What about V1? V1, so 2 to the -1 is half, and omega is between -half pi, or -pi over 2, and plus pi over 2. And now, with the same horizontal axis, I'm in a narrower range. What about V-1? Now the frequency range is between -2 pi n plus 2 pi. And we have the wider range. So as we go to VJs with small j, j going to negative infinity, we span more and more frequencies. We cover all functions. And as we, on the other hand, move to large j's, we span a minimal frequency range. And in the limit, we don't span anything, right? And another issue here is that if you look at V1, V0 is equal to V1 plus this red part. And V negative 1 is equal to V0 plus this red part. So we can always write, let's say V negative 3 as a red part going from negative 2 to negative 3, another red part going from negative 1 to negative 2, and so on, where we begin with some V that covers the lower frequencies. And you'll note that these red parts are actually bandpass. They correspond to the wavelets, whereas the lower frequencies are something different. And that's the relationship between the phis and the size. So here are the differences between multi-resolution approximation spaces. So we have, recall that f is a function in L2 of R, and Vj is nested in Vj minus 1, and the approximation of f in Vj minus 1 contains details that are not in Vj. So to try to sketch this, we have f, and we can perhaps project it to f. I'll just write f sub j as the projection of f in Vj. Or we can project it a second time to fj minus 1, and fj minus 1 contains more details. So this is equal to fj plus details. Now, these details, they may by chance, the difference when we project f to Vj and Vj minus 1, they may be identical. So by chance, there may be no additional details, but oftentimes there will be. And we can write that Vj minus 1 is a direct sum between two vector spaces, Vj and Wj. And Wj is the difference, the details that differentiate between Vj, the scale with less information, and Vj minus 1. Now, Wj is an orthogonal complement of Vj in Vj minus 1, and it contains all the vectors in Vj minus 1 that are orthogonal to Vj. So we can write that for all V tilde j in Vj minus 1, there exists a unique, the exclamation mark means unique, Vj is an element, lowercase vj is an element of the space Vj, and Wj is an element, lowercase wj is an element of the space capital Wj, and V tilde j is equal to Vj plus Wj. And moreover, all the Wj's are orthogonal to all the Vj's. So you can look at the supplement on direct sum, but it means that we have two vector spaces. But again, we have this property where we have that one vector space is has the property that every element in it has a unique decomposition into two vectors in the two other spaces. And these vectors in the two other spaces are always going to be orthogonal. All right, so now more about differences. We can write that PVJ minus 1F, which is a projection of F to the space Vj minus 1, is equal to a projection of F to the space Vj plus a projection of F to the space Wj. And we've already said that Wj are the details that are not in Vj, and the Wj's are the wavelets. Okay, so these are what we earlier discussed as the psi functions at a certain scale, and the psi functions are connecting between the phi functions at different scales. We can also write that the function f is a projection of f to the space v0, and that's going to be a projection at scale 2 to the power of 0. Plus we have projections to scales 2 to the negative 1, 2 to the negative 2, but we're only adding in the details. So this is the approximation at scale 2 to the 0 is 1, plus details moving us to the next scale, half. So we're shifting to half. And then PW minus 1 shifts us to a quarter. And we're shifting to finer and finer scale every time that we're adding in these projected versions of F's. So we started at scale 2 to the power of 0, j equals 0, but we could have started elsewhere. And if we started at 2 to the 0, that corresponds to the original phi function. And if we started elsewhere, we would have had to take a scaled version of the phi function. So let's revisit an example of this cameraman image that we've seen before. The input image, we're looking at its wavelet decomposition. And at the coarsest scale, Vj, we have these bright colored coefficients. And then Wj are the details in 3 different subbands that correspond to vertical and horizontal parts. And this part is called HH. Both of them are higher frequencies. And the original part, Vj, is the lower part. And the other 2 parts, let's say number 2 and number 3, correspond to low-high and high-low. So the Vj combined with the 3 Wj's takes us to implicitly Vj minus 1. And then adding in the details of Wj minus 1, these 3 subbands of wavelets takes us to Vj minus 2. And adding in this subband and so on takes us to Vj minus 1. And finally, we have the subbands at the finest scale. At the coarsest scale, you could think about this as the phi function. The phi function includes DC components, and the DC components have a lot of energy. That's why we have the bright colored wavelet coefficients. And all the other scales are basically W's and not V's. So these are, if the original was the phi's, after that, in the multi-resolution approximation, we're adding in more and more details. Those are the psi functions, the bandpass filters. Now, another advantage of wavelets is that if you start with the coarsest scale, the lowest frequency coefficients, the brightly colored ones, and then you add Wj, and then you add Wj minus 1, and so on, you're getting, over time, a more and more detailed version of your image. However, at any time if you stop, what the information that you've gotten so far gives you the best quality image that you can get with that amount of information. Okay, so that's a nice property visually, and it's used in some browsers. So we'll wrap up this segment of material on multi-resolution approximation with a computational discussion. We start with an input, and the high-pass components are output as wavelet coefficients, the W's, and the low-pass components could be interpreted as V's, but we could also iterate them and take another iteration of high pass and low pass, and the high pass part. So let's kind of sketch this. So if we kind of horizontal axis is frequencies, the larger parts are W in iteration number 1, okay? And then we could just deal with the lower frequencies, or iteratively we can say that this part is the W in iteration number 2, and then iteratively this part is the W in iteration number 3, and finally you have the low pass part, and the low pass part is the phi part, and the other parts are the psi parts. Psi are bandpass, phi is low pass. We output the courses scale, the V function, the phi part, one time after all the iterations are done. And this can be implemented with filter banks. Filter banks are a way how you cascade filters in an iterative way. And overall, this can be implemented in a low complexity scheme. So that'll be it for multi-resolution approximation, and we'll continue next time.